Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at our Toronto 2019 and for our Power Talk series here. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land that we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather here this afternoon. And I'd like to introduce Josh Human from the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery.
Great, thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Human. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery. We're pleased that for the 13th year, we are presenting a trio of Power Talks during Art Toronto, with thanks to Art Toronto, especially thanks to Mia Nielsen and her team. The Power Plant is located at Harbourfront Centre, just a few blocks south of here, and we present exhibitions by Canadian and international artists, predominantly emerging and mid-career artists who have not yet had solo exhibitions in Toronto or in Canada. Our Fall 2019 exhibitions are currently on view through early January 2020, and they feature Canadian artist Hajra Wahid, Belgian artist Vincent Mizan, Bangladeshi British artist Naeem Mohamed, and a new commission by American artist Rashid Johnson. The Power Plant also has a booth here at Art Toronto along the back wall, and we're featuring this year a limited edition tote bag designed by Rashid Johnson, and publications related to recent exhibitions. Now, of course, to complement our exhibitions, each season we offer numerous public programs and education programs, so if you haven't already, please check out our website at thepowerplant.org. So today we focus on the second of three Power Talks, each of them corresponding to Art Toronto's focus on Portugal. But before I introduce today's speaker, I hope to entice you to attend the next, which is tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. We'll have Denise Ferreira da Silva, Professor and Director of the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia, and she'll be exploring what happens to the thesis of the possibility or impossibility of justice when considered through artistic practice, referring to works by contemporary artists including Carlos Mota, Otobong Inkanga, and Paulo Nazareth. But about today's speaker, Angela Ferreira grew up in South Africa and obtained her MFA at the University of Cape Town. After resettling in Portugal, she earned her doctorate at Lisbon University, where she currently teaches fine art. Her sculptural, sound, and videographic homages reference economic, political, and cultural history of the African continent, whilst recuperating the work of unexpected figures, including Peter Bloom, Carlos Cardosa, Jimi Hendrix, Diego Rivera, and Miriam Makeba. She's represented Portugal at the 52nd Venice Biennale in 2007, and her talk today is entitled Pan-African Unity Mural. So please welcome Angela Ferreira.
Good afternoon, everybody. So let me start by thanking Josh for the great introduction, and thanking Gaeta Berna and the Power Plant for inviting me to Toronto. This is my first visit to Toronto, and I'm also thankful to Art Toronto. So the roots of my practice was physically and conceptually laid down somewhere between Cape Town, Lisbon, and Maputo in Mozambique. Over the years, I've avoided the autobiographic turn at all costs, but I have to admit that the geographies and their politics have had a big impact on me and subsequently on my work. As I look back, I notice that there's hardly a text written about my work that does not turn to my personal history. So obviously that will be coming up. 30-odd years ago, when I started my practice, I would have said that my intention was to work with the relationship between Africa and the Western world. I would look critically at colonial history at continued neocolonial practices, I would consider the Western world's inability to decolonize and the eternal avoidance of reparation. That I would critically consider art history, particularly the 20th century. To be specific, I was interested in modernism. And my interest in modernism derives from two good reasons. Firstly, I studied at the end of the 70s in an art school in Cape Town, as Josh mentioned, modeled on English-style Anglo-Saxon art education. And at the time, modernism ruled. My first critical faculties were exactly on the validity of this European and American modernism in Africa. Secondly, because it is precisely during modernism that we experience colonialism, and I was interested in discovering the connections between these two systems of thought. The irony of the dictatorship of the modernist language as being the only valid one, and also the fact that it was pushed and validated mainly by all male artists. This was a challenge to me as a young artist. You will see later. I've done this through various lines of work which run concurrently. They're different, but in my mind they're all coherent. I'll not be able to show you all today. It's 30 years of practice, impossible to show in one afternoon, but I'd like to mention a few. So architecture has been one of my points of reference, and mainly I look at architecture because I believe buildings are objects that we can read. I see buildings as objects that are sociological, they're historical, they're sculptural, they're anthropological, and they are political, inherently because of their histories and their use. So, because they are also sculptures, and I'm trained in sculptures, I've always thought buildings were good starting points of understanding events and history. And throughout my career, a lot of my work has been referenced on specific buildings which tell ensuing stories. Then I've also looked at music quite closely, mostly because music has an incredible faculty of being able to enter your brain directly. It's not mediated by your eyes, it's not mediated by much. And especially if you're using phones, it goes directly into your body and your soul. And that, as a way of communicating meaning, has been quite a source of questioning for me. I've always thought that music was a privileged form, as opposed to sculpture or visual images that have to be mediated. I've worked a lot on homages to role models, African role models, people like Rouch or Miriam Makeba that I'll show you today, or Peter Bloom. I believe, because my practice is quite critical, at some points I feel the need to invest in some way that is more hopeful and more constructive. And the way I've done that over the years is to choose African role models, people that I admire. Some are very well known, like Miriam Makeba, and some aren't well known, like the journalist Rouch Cardozo. But they are people who have been incredibly resourceful within the African context and have actually come up with practices, whether in music, whether in poetry, whether in journalism, and come up with practices that are truly innovative and people that I would like to copy, people that I would like to be like. My other source of interest has been ethnography. Ethnography, for obvious reasons, ethnography is the science that is born with colonialism. It's that which comes out of Europeans invading Africa and the need for Europeans to study and to look at Africans. So inevitably through my processes I had to come across ethnography, which led me to study particular ethnographers, mostly to do with Mozambique. And finally, I've looked at film, practical films that are often made and attached to ethnographic practices and that accompany ethnographic practices. So those have been the kind of resources that I've used to work with. Studying in apartheid South Africa, late 70s and early 80s, also defines the political nature of my work. Let's just say that politicization happened as a youngster during the last decade of apartheid. The country was burning. Politics were urgent, fast, very nasty, racialized, and violent. Being a white girl had its complexities, but there was no other position possible other than opposing the government. That was my informal school. And my informal school I consider as important as my formal school. The work is not pamphleteering, however. It is political in rather subtle way. It prods and opens up issues and asks questions. And you will see some that do that too. I should also mention that most of the 90s, when I started spending time in Portugal, my work then was about dealing directly with the context of Portugal, which at this date was still basically in denial about Africa and its own history with it. In denial about colonialism, and even more about the messy decolonizing process which had ensued after the Carnation Revolution in 1974 that brought about democracy to the country at the end of formal colonialism. Today, however, I would say my work is much more concerned with interconnections between spaces and people. Still the same spaces and mostly the same people, broadly speaking, but rather I look at them through the rich connections I can establish between them and the readings of those interconnections. The work is necessarily more about travel, Africans who have traveled and what that means, looking at these crossings and their political implications, imagining and daring to dream of new meetings, also researching Europeans who have traveled in Africa and the reasons and effects thereof, looking at the crossings and intersections, imagining constructive and creative circulations in Africa. I know Canadians have led the way in terms of museum consultation with Indigenous communities affected by anthropological collecting. I was listening carefully at last night's Black Curators Forum, for which I'm very thankful to have been invited to. So let's just see how this goes now. All right, so the first work that I'm going to be talking about, so what I've chosen to do is picked on about 4 or 5 works starting way back in my practice to give you a bit of context. So Double-Sided comes out of my intense readings in the 90s, mostly Homi Bhabha, and very specifically, I'm not going to go on to a big philosophical discussion, but I will tell you that I was particularly taken with a point by Homi Bhabha in which he talks about a piece of paper which you could write on both sides of, and he talks about that piece of paper as a metaphor for the fact the contents that's on one side of the paper does not annul the contents that's on the other side of the paper. And that idea of double-sidedness, which Bhabha explores profoundly, comes back from other people, but that was my starting point. So I was on a residency. Is this water? Is this water?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I was in a residency in Marfa, in Texas, at the Chinati Foundation, the place where Donald Judd did his work and established a museum. And I was young, and just out of apartheid, I was really shocked by the opulence of the place and the power that Judd had amassed, which was visible through this incredible foundation. I was in awe and I was in shock. But so this is an image of the Chinati Foundation. On the right are the artillery sheds where Judd has his 100 boxes of aluminium, and on the left are some spaces where I worked, which were less built up, less finished up. And this is also in Marfa, the office that Judd used as his architectural practice. Even though he wasn't a qualified architect, his brother was. He ended up buying a good part of the city of Marfa and quite a lot of the farms around there, and his presence is omnipresent. So I was interested in critically looking at that. And what really amazed me was the fact that I came from South Africa and I knew this place very well. We're now in South Africa in the little Karoo, and this is New Bethesda. This is a little village where an artist, a South African woman artist, worked called Helen Martyrs. So you can see the similarities of the landscape. And I was shocked at how different landscapes could home such diverse and contradictory practices. Now, Helen Martens, this is the interior of a house. Both of them built cement sculptures outside their houses, their homes, in their respective places, but then they were very different people. So Donald Judd, I don't need to define for you. Helen Martens was a self-taught artist, a woman who fell in love with her assistant who was not white, and so she was living a life, an illegal life in South Africa, and she had she was a school teacher, she was fired from being a school teacher, and ended up taking her life. But she constructed an interior, a very expressive interior in her own home. A lot of the walls, for example, are covered in ground glass. So she would take bottles, grind them in a grinder, an old-fashioned grinder, and then glue them on the walls. So you literally can't go next to the walls because you'll scratch your skin. So it's an all at once violent and beautiful environment. She also used a lot of mirrors and color glass to filter the light into her space. So my project started when I realized that there was a strange connection through the places and the divergences between the two artists. The one male, rich, powerful, and the other one without a voice, and having ended up taking her life in Africa. And so I developed a project which went like this. I went to Martha again, and I proposed to build an installation which was loosely based on the house of Helen Martens in New Bethesda. So I literally took Helen Martens to Donald Judd's space. So this is images of, can you see the images from here? It looks completely not, it's okay? It looks beautiful on here, but not on here. So this is the installation that I built. I worked for 2 weeks, often just with finding materials and buying scrap materials in garage sales, and built a little environment which was evocative of Helen Martens' space. I used just cellophane to filter the just like she did, but without using glass, and worked quite a lot on this particular detail which she left in her home, which was her bed, where there were 2 dolls. I don't think you can see a thing, but there's a white person and a black person lying next to one another. So these are details of what I constructed in Martha. So the following year, I went to New Bethesda and built an installation evocative of Donald Judd. So I worked with the aluminium structures that fronted the artillery sheds which I showed you earlier, and put them on the facade of the building that I worked in New Bethesda, and inside the space, copying Judd's own furniture design, which is very easy to copy, as some of you will know, because most of it is modular. So provided you're working with the same factory of wood providers, you can construct his furniture very easily. And did a similar thing, which is construct a space which was loosely evocative of Judd's environment in so this would be a reproduction of the window of that architectural space that I showed you on. So there's all the places he had, starting in New York, in Chinati, and so on. And so each of those installations was, the only person who saw the 2 installations was myself. I documented them extensively, and over the years I've done a series of presentations and a series of works based on those installations. Some of them are image-filled. In this particular case, this is in the second Johannesburg Biennale. So as you enter the space and the wall, there's a series of photographs of one of the installations, and then on the inside there is the Donald Judd space reconstructed again. So this would be in the inside of that space. Then I've done versions that are much more succinct and much more minimal. In this particular case in Germany, there was just a table with a globe where I pinpointed the 2 locales where the 2 people came from, and there were 2 large photographs on the wall. One showed my intervention in Chinati, and the other one showed my intervention in New Bethesda. Later on, in Cape Town, at a show that celebrated Opry's Biennale Trade Routes, I built this cabinet, which is also a double-sided, so you're looking at the same cabinet. On the one side, the image is at the bottom, on the other side, the image is on top, and we printed a double-sided pamphlet which explained the project and contained original texts that I wrote at the time. So there's the detail of the book on Judd and the double-sided pamphlets. And then I've also built, I think, which are some of my most satisfactory versions, which are these very, very succinct pieces, which just include 2 photographs and a piece of furniture designed according to Judd's measurements with the 2 books. And very recently, in the Centro Galego de Arte Contemporáneo in Spain, I built this version, which includes not only a wooden shelving unit designed by Judd, but the table, which you may remember from an earlier photograph that belonged to Helen Martens. So I believe I've made over 10 versions of this work. It's a work that keeps coming up as a source for discussion, and it was a very marking work because it was, although in appearance it's very minimal, it was, I suppose, some of my first forays into criticality beyond the Portuguese or the South African Mozambican contexts. And obviously it requires compassion to understand Helen Martens' position, and it requires criticality to understand what I was trying to point to in terms of Judd's position as the master of minimalism in the Western world. 10 years after that, I started on a project called Maison Tropicale, which was based on a house. I can't see a thing. So Maison Tropicale was a building designed by Jean Prouvé. Jean Prouvé was an exemplary architect, an exemplary designer. He was French. He was contemporary to Corbusier, but didn't quite claim as much notoriety as Corbusier, mostly because Prouvé himself was actually more modest and more democratic. His practice as an architect was actually a fairly democratic practice. But like many architects at the time, after the Second World War, he was drawn into the colonial project. And the way he was drawn into the colonial project was this. He was, at the time, developing prefabricated houses in the spirit of the reconstruction of Europe, which after the war had been devastated. Prouvé was interested in prefabricated houses, particularly in aluminium. He had a factory in the north of France, and he designed this house called Maison Tropicale, which was supposed to be a house that the French were going to take to Africa, to Congo and to Niger. In the spirit of the last throes of colonialism, where the winds of change were blowing, colonial powers understood that they needed to invest in their colonies if they wanted to retain some kind of hold onto them. And so a couple of incredibly ambitious and amazing, ridiculous projects were invented. In this particular case, Prouvé was to design a house, and 10,000 units were supposed to be shipped to Niger and to the Congo. So I came across, because somewhere along the line somebody mentioned the Congo house. I went to look at it, and I realized the house was in fact, let me go back a bit. So this is the photo. I work on research like most artists do, and some of the images of research are evocative starting points. This was one of my favorite images. So this would have been the aeroplane carrying the houses to Africa. So they were prefab, so they were in parts, they were easy to carry. Warplanes had been adapted to carry things. So this was one of the old warplanes that was now adapted to carry Maison Tropicale. And this is one of the first images of the one version of Maison Tropicale, which was installed in Niger, in Niamey. I really can't see much, so I hope you can see more. Yeah? And this is the image of the other two versions. Only 3 prototypes went to Africa. They were mostly unliked in Africa. They were considered to be like spaceships. Thought by Africans considered them like spaceships, and they were not interested in them. They were in fact scared of them. There are reports of people crossing to another street not to have to walk in the same street where the house was installed. And on the other hand, the settlers, the European settlers, didn't like them either because they were not colonial enough. They didn't have the charm of what colonial architecture was supposed to be, so they were basically disliked. The project failed, but the product itself is quite an extraordinary design project. It's a very sculptural thing, and what happened was that I got to understand that in the wake of the rediscovering of Jean Prouvaire in the early 2000s, a gallerist and sponsors went to Africa and claimed to have discovered these houses in Africa. They proceeded, this is what they looked like in 2002. So this photograph there is from 2002. And so this is the image of somebody living in the house in 2002. And what happened is that they thought it profitable enough to remove the houses from Africa, pack them back into a container, bring them to Europe, restore them, and sell them on the art market. So none of this is my work, obviously, this is just my research. When I got to this part of the story, I realized there was a project in there for me, and I also realized that my project was very difficult because I really admired Prouvaire's work. I really admired the aesthetic and planning qualities of the architectural project, and yet I was very critical of the colonial project that had taken the houses to Africa in the second place, and even more critical, as you can imagine, of the neocolonial project, which in 2002 brings them to Europe and sells them. So I wasn't sure what I could do how I could sculpturally not offend Prouvaire and yet be critical about this whole story. So, this is an image of the presentation of the house in New York. When it was auctioned by Christie's, it sold for $6.5 million, supposedly to become a boutique hotel. Till this moment, I have no idea where that hotel is, but that was the sale. The other one belongs to the Pompidou in Paris, and there's the third item, which as yet I believe is in storage, because eventually the project became quite problematic and quite aired in the critical discourses, so we are waiting to see what happens to the third one. So I went through various possibilities. I knew I had to reconstruct the house, but I knew I couldn't reconstruct the house, because if I reconstructed the house, I would be celebrating the project. If I didn't reconstruct the house, I wouldn't be pointing to the house. So I investigated on several areas, and one of the areas that I investigated a lot on was the fact that I worked out that they stole the aluminium portions of the house, but that it was unlikely that they would have stolen the cement bases that the houses were installed on. Now, I'd seen the full documentation of Prouvaire's drawings, and I knew he'd actually designed the cement bases quite specifically with floor tiles, and in the case of Brazzaville, he had actually designed pilotis very much in the modernist tradition. So I knew exactly what the sculptural elements of the cement bases would look like, and so I became curious as to what happened to the cement that they couldn't have stolen. So through research and through people on the ground, we identified and found the places where the houses had been installed, and thereby found the cement places. But before that, I'd actually drawn the cement portions to try and understand how it worked. in my studio, I was accompanied by two very important images. The one on the left is the image designed by a man called Banil, who was Prouvé's assistant, and who planned how the houses would be packed into the containers, originally in 1949. And on my right is a plan of slave ship Brooks, which I'm sure many of you know. And for me, there was a kind of parallel between the two stories, and the images pointed to the criticality that I was interested in. So I started developing a sculpture, which was a container which held all the parts of the house, designed and built to scale and rearranged in a different way. And that way I discovered a way to put the house in transit permanently, reconstruct it, allow somebody to walk into it, but never to be in Prouvé's house as Prouvé's house was. So this was my very quick and fast drawing after a long time of suffering, and that was the sculpture that was built in the end about Maison Tropicale. But that doesn't complete the project. When we built the sculpture, I realized that I was lacking visuality and I was lacking contact with the spaces in Africa. So I proposed to the curator to go to Africa and to source out the spaces. And so when you walked into the exhibition, and this is my favorite presentation of the work, you never saw the container, that monumental container that I've just shown you, you never saw it. You actually had to walk through it before you understood the scale of the project that you were engaging with. So here you see two people going into the pavilion in Venice and starting to go in through the container, and here you see the route that you can take through the container. And as you start getting to the other end of the sculpture, you start becoming aware of images on the wall. And the images on the wall are precisely the images that I captured on finding the spaces in Brazzaville and in Niamey. So it's only when you walk out of the container and turn your back to the images that you realize the scale of the sculpture that you have just engaged with. And so I'll run through the photographs as well. So this was the one platform we found almost intact, and you can see it here on the left. I, by this stage, knew the project so well, I could work out where it implanted the sticks into the cement, where the toilet was, and found vestiges of where all the ceramic tiles that had been pulled up were. Niamey is very hot, so it's 45, 46 degrees midday, very difficult to do anything with a platform of cement. It really boils. You can see in some of these images, you can see traces of where the tiles were. This is now on the other side. We're now in Brazzaville, which is tropical, equatorial, and much more lush. And all we could find here mostly were the old pilotis, which you can still see there and there, where the houses rested on. And then one little bit of a yard where a couple of pilotis hadn't been occupied. I need somebody to give me a 5-minute warning, please, because I talk a lot and I don't watch the time. So, I've already done 57 minutes?
No.
Oh, that said there 57 minutes.
You're good.
Okay. Right, this next project is the one about the ethnographers, Mozambican ethnographers. This is from 2015. And here I studied Jorge Dias on the left and his wife Margot Dias. Jorge Dias is hailed as the father of Portuguese ethnography. He founded the Museum of Ethnography in Lisbon, and he was an eminent ethnographer running campaigns in northern Mozambique. His wife was not an ethnographer, she was a musician who became a music ethnographer, accompanied him on all 5 campaigns, and she became interested in films, and she filmed the Makonde people, which Jorge Dias was studying in northern Mozambique. And it was really through the films of Margot Dias that I became interested in the couple. And Jorge Dias was the head of this very odd, so we're talking about the dictatorship, We're talking about the dictatorship in Portugal. We're talking about the time when there's a ministry, the overseas ministry. It's a highly politicized situation. There is the warnings of a liberation war beginning to sound on the horizon, and Jorge Dias was the head of this department, which I think you can read the translation for there. His wife was making the films that I mentioned to you. I filmed the films, unfortunately at the time without permission, because I couldn't get permission, from a television. And basically the films are pretty boring ethnographic films of people dancing, children playing games. She was basically following him around, photographing and filming what he did. It's old-fashioned, even by the time, in ethnographic practices. Theirs was a very conservative ethnographic look at the other, in a very paternalistic, very racist sort of way. And obviously it was very offensive to me, but nothing new. All colonial countries had ethnography at their service, doing pretty much the same thing. Some a bit more advanced, some a bit more progressive, but basically they were all doing it. So here's some images of the films, some of the rituals that the Makon people, like she would be filming things like initiation ceremonies, which I believe she shouldn't have been allowed to attend. So the usual kind of upsetting imagery for somebody working today. But what was interesting to me, so this is the building of the ministry, the overseas ministry in Portugal. It's kind of like a modernist fascist architecture. It's a particular strain of architecture which adhered to some of the modernist traits, but always had a very imposing, omnipresent feel about it. And what became interesting to me, the project grew very slowly on me. Well, the first thing that I became interested in was the fact that Jorge Dias's office for the minority studies was in this building. So he was working next door to the minister, the overseas minister. And I started suspecting that the work was more politicized than just a simple ethnographic study. Then I looked a little bit further and I realized that the Museum of Ethnography was across the road from the ministry, the overseas ministry. And I'm an artist and I can use free association if I want to. And I associated that if he was looking for a museum, he asked the minister to build the museum for him whilst he was doing the campaigns. And the ground was available and the museum was made real for Jorge Dias just across the road and overlooking the ministry. So I took some pictures. So the following pictures you'll see will just show you how close the two buildings are. So on the left, the remnants of the Museum of Ethnology, and at the bottom of the image, the pink building, is the ministry. So they really were hand in hand. And here again, on the right, the Museum of Ethnology, and on the left, the museum. But where things became interesting was when I realized that, in fact, every time Jorge Dias did a campaign and returned to Lisbon, he was compelled and asked to write a secret report to Antonio Oliveira Salazar, who was then the dictator, in which he reported not on ethnographic stuff, but on lots of other stuff that wasn't necessarily ethnographic, socio-political stuff. Now, Jorge Dias was not a fool. He was an intelligent man, and people will argue that for the time he was a progressive man. But he was having to write 20-page reports in which he was talking about how the populations were using radio and listening to the transmissions that were coming from Tanzania, so that because Tanzania was already empowered by Julius Nyerere, and so they could be badly influenced, according to Jorge Dias. He would write about how badly the Africans spoke of the Portuguese. He would give advice on, if we want to be liked, we should do this and we should do that. In other words, there was a very clear political work done. We can be harsh, I can be harsh if I want to. He was spying, basically. That's what he was doing. In fact, upon doing a lot of research, I found that he was even compelled to visit Tanzania himself to understand how the system worked there. He also lectured in Johannesburg, full on in apartheid times. And furthermore, he was infiltrated at the Cairo University to understand how Muslim universities worked. So I came to understand the very harsh complexities of what ethnography was working for a political system. So I drew from my video stills that I had, and so before we get to explaining what this image is I decided to make a film that somehow integrated the videos from Margot Diaz and another video that I've been working with for many, many years, which was a very interesting document made by settlers in Mozambique in the last throes of colonial rule. So I was looking at Margot Diaz's gaze on the Makonj, and on the other hand, I was using an old tool, returning the gaze, looking at what the settlers looked like in the so-called multicultural, wonderful Mozambique of the last days of colonial rules. And I made this film. I might have time to show a little bit at the end. And I constructed a sculpture that was based on the building of the ministry, the overseas ministry, but had a spiral staircase that you walked into. So the photographs you see on the left there are the pictures that I showed you early on, where you see the documents of the two buildings, the Museum of Ethnology and the overseas ministry, and the pictures where you see the two of them crossing paths. And then, can't see a thing, so I'm going to look here because it makes me unhappy to look there. So a couple of views. So the sculpture was suspended, and the idea was that you had to walk into the evil building, and you had to become a voyeur yourself to look at the film. They were all worried that I had so many slides, but I go quickly. So this gives you the idea of the installation. And then inside the sculpture, there's a little amphitheater, and the video is running. We do have the video here. If there's time at the end, I may show a bit of it. Okay, so now we come to Pan-African Unity Mural. We are now in 2018, much closer to what I was talking about earlier on when I said I'm interested in intersections. I'm interested in the history of movements in Africa. The fact that Africans, we were visiting a museum this morning, and we were looking at the gold caravans, and looking at the maps in the 5th and 8th century of how Africans crossed the continent with goods. And I've become interested in those crossings and how the Berlin Conference crossed up Africa and separated it and impeded those circulations. Because I think intersections are places where creative things happen. It's where you meet, where you share, you barter, you swap ideas. They're very powerful ways of sharing and communicating. And in many ways, the present Africa has been impeded from continuing that tradition. And so I'm looking at how are Africans doing those circulations today. And so I decided to do a work about 3 people, and all 3 are circulators. One is Miriam Makeba, and I started off with houses, as I often do. So the top left-hand one is Miriam Makeba's house in Conakry, because she was in exile from South Africa. I don't know how much you know about Miriam Makeba. She's a famous singer. Some of you will know who she was. And she was exiled in Conakry, looking for a place, a piece of land to live in. And so she lived in Conakry, and that's the house she lived in. And I'll go through that. The one on the right is actually the modernist house that it's the first time I bring myself in a very clear autobiographical way. I said I'd come around to the autobiography, so here we go. This is the house that my parents built just before I was born, and where I lived in Mozambique, very modernist house, and this is the house that got me thinking about modernism. And at the bottom is the house of another very interesting personality started off being called George the Right, and is now called George dos Santos. So let me do what I can with what we've got. This is the house of George dos Santos. He lives in Pulares, which is a village just outside Lisbon. A man with an incredible history, George Wright. All three personalities are travelers. Miriam Makeba is exiled out of South Africa. She travels to Venice because she's cast into a film by Rogozin called Come Back Africa, and they removed her passport. She goes to New York, where she's helped by Harry Belafonte to start a music career. She falls in love with Stokely Carmichael from the Black Panther Party, and they get ostracized from America, and they have to flee. They are invited by Sékou Touré, who was the president of Guinea, and he invites them, Conakry, he invites them to come and live in Conakry, and it's at that point that she builds the house that I showed you earlier on. So I was interested. She eventually fled from Conakry. Sékou Touré himself became a bad dictator, and she ended up taking refuge in Brussels. She returns to South Africa to sing for the inauguration of Nelson Mandela in 1994. So she's traveled Johannesburg, New York, Conakry, Brussels, and back to South Africa. These are basic, and obviously she traveled widely because she was a famous singer, but those are her life travels. I used myself as an example, Mozambican born, early on to Cape Town, then to Lisbon, back to Cape Town, back to Lisbon, back to Mozambique, and now back in Lisbon, the last stretch. And George Wright, a very interesting person who I came across in the newspaper, a man who was born in America, in the southern states. He goes as a youngster to New York, and he gets involved in a robbery, assault, where a person dies. He gets put into prison in Pennsylvania state. He's politicized in prison by the Black Panther Party elements that are sharing space with him. They escape out of Pennsylvania state prison, and they head on to Detroit to try and join the party. The party, of course, tells them, look, you cannot stay here because you are, sought after by the FBI, as we are too, so you need to move on. They decide, him and his group, they decide to hijack a plane, a Delta Airlines flight that went from Detroit to Miami, from Miami to Boston, and from Boston to Algeria. And they did this very successfully by dressing as a priest, holding a gun inside a Bible, and they swapped the passengers in Miami for $1 million or a lot of money, but they swapped the passengers. They got to Algiers, and they were told by the party, you need to return the money, the plane, and the crew, but you can stay, which they did. And they eventually left Algeria, went on to Paris, and from Paris the group split, and George Wright comes to Lisbon. Just after the 74 revolution, he gets caught up in the wake of the Corps Branch, which are people who are going back to Africa to help build the new nations. And he goes to Guinea as well. And he lives in Guinea. He's an escape from the CIA. He lives in Guinea for 16 years, very happily. He marries a Portuguese woman. He takes on Portuguese citizenship and changes his name to Jorge dos Santos. In 2003 or 4, they decide to leave Guinea, and they come to live in Lisbon in that little house that I showed you earlier on. And 2 or 3 years ago, the Portuguese must have connected their information with the American system, and the Americans identified him in Lisbon, and they asked the Portuguese authorities to extradite him so he could come and serve the end of his sentence for the robbery plus the hijack. Luckily for him, the Portuguese, he went to court, he had a band on his leg, and there was a court case, and the Portuguese decided not to allow him to be extradited because he was very well integrated in the community. He has 2 children, he teaches basketball, and they don't seem to have problems. So he lives down the road. Man with this extraordinary history lives down the road in Lisbon. So these are my 3 figures. And then I was wanting to represent them in different ways. And So if you look at the images that you see here, you will see that on the wall, for example, there's a line drawing of an aeroplane. Those are drawings over there. So those are drawings I made. They're painted as murals from the photographs of the New York Times of the hijack. It was an amazing story where when they said they would like the $1 million, they also said the FBI who brings the $1 million onto the plane must come in a swimsuit because they were scared they would be armed. So the New York Times managed to take these amazing photographs of these FBI agents with a suitcase and $1 million in a Speedo on the tarmac. And so that's what I'm depicting over there. So, and then on this side over here, I'm depicting the veranda of Miriam Makeba's house. I was going to explain this to you. So one of the architectural features of the house was the veranda. She chose a spot in Conakry that specifically reminded her of Johannesburg, where she came from. And she had the veranda built so she could spend time looking at the landscape. And she writes extensively about that. I was touched by that. I was touched, as I said to you earlier, and I even had a song to play about the fact that she was obviously looking for a place to lay down roots in Africa. And she was connecting Conakry and Johannesburg, so that's her veranda. And then I represented myself through a series of murals that I painted as a young girl, as an activist, what we used to call a cultural worker in South Africa, with a group of people. I painted murals, political murals. So I asked permission to the group again to repaint some of those political murals, which were painted in the 80s in South Africa. At the time, the group was obviously not known by name. We couldn't be known, but now we've reconstituted the group, and I was going to show you images of them as well, because they will be upset that I haven't, but that's just how things go. So over there is the mural depictions, and over there. And this tower here came from one of Diego Rivera's murals in San Francisco, which is in fact called the Pan American Unity Mural, which is where I got the title for the work. This is the work that's called Pan African Unity Mural. And in that mural, Diego Rivera paints a crane. So it's a system of transporting material, like a crane that you use in ports and shipping or in building yards to carry materials from one side to the other. So my idea, and in the drawings, which you can't see, you'd be able to see the crane as a symbol of something that transported objects and elements. So I'm alluding to the circulations that I was speaking to you early on about, and to the intersections thereof. My query here is really about these three Africans who circulate in the world, and what does this mean? What does it mean that Africans circulate, and what happens when we circulate, and what are we producing with those circulations? Those are a lot of my questions at the moment as an artist. So a few more images. So there's, so again, the mural, and the mural now, I should just say, is situated in a building. It's a political building called Community House in Cape Town, and it was the building, I think it was funded by the Norwegians at the time of apartheid still, to house NGOs which were illegal in South Africa. So it's a building with a very long political history. And some of the details of the paintings on the wall are actually photographs of that are installed in the building as well. Some, for example, in this case, documenting a trade union meeting in the early 80s in South Africa. So there you have George Wright. That's George Wright painted on the wall. And there on that little detail there is from the ceiling of Miriam Makeba's house, was very beautifully detailed with basketry and reliefs all over the interior of the house, done in a very typical Conakry architectural detail. So I depicted some of them on the wall. Oops, not that, but this. So you can see the murals are very much of their time. This is mid-80s. They're kind of depicting the people that we wanted to relate to. The workers, the women, the children, the students. There's a little boy reading the book, and was freedom or death, victory is certain. Some of the stickers that we were printing in the workshop at the time. We were a community group working for organizations, for trade unions, and so on. And there on the right here, you see a phantom house. This is actually my house, the one that I showed you the picture of. There's a closer image. This is another iteration of the project in Spain, so that just gives you a better picture of the phantom house. And I think that's the last image. I won't have time for that due to all this confusion. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions you will need to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Angela. Apologies for technical glitches. But I do have this microphone. If anyone has any questions at all, just raise your hand and go ahead and ask. I'll sort of pitch out a question. So how is it that these three figures in particular sort of came together in your mind? And is there anything about their personalities that, or their personal histories that brought them together, other than sort of geographies?
Yeah, a mixture of things. You know, the geographies was one of the first things that got me started. The fact that I'd found out that Jorge dos Santos and both Makeba and Jorge dos Santos had been in Guinea at the same time was to me kind of an odd coincidence, and so I started relating to that. The other thing was that Makeba had done a song very early in her life, which I would have loved to play for you today, and maybe we can play it as we end, I don't know, which was about a piece of ground. So she's talking about African soil and how the white man came and took the soil and how luscious the soil was and so on. The role model idea, you know, that I spoke to you about earlier, where I'm looking for models for myself. You know, I'm looking for positive inputs, people who kind of invested their lives in inspiring ways and can like allow me to move on. And then politically also alluding to the difficulties in circulations on the African continent, and how we don't have to think of circulations as circulations were thought of in the 5th century, obviously, where people were with caravans moving along, but we move in different ways, you know, but those circulations are incredibly rich at the same time. Yeah.
Great. Last call for questions. I'm sure Angela will be more than happy to stick around a few minutes if anyone does have questions. Thank you so much for your talk.